Welcome to this video looking at Unit 2, Health and Social Care, particularly working in social care. Now with exams approaching, I want to take a little bit of time to look at how we could develop merit grade responses and turn them hopefully into distinction responses. And what I've got here are some student exemplar answers from the January 22 paper. And we're just going to look at the difference between merit grade and distinction and what the students are doing in each case. So what we're going to look at on this topic is January's 2022 exam paper. We're going to take two student responses, student A and B. Student A achieved a high merit, student B achieved a distinction. And both students were very, very similar in their grade. So in section A and B of the paper, both students were getting pretty much the same scores per answer. So there wasn't really much of a difference. It was C and D which led to that overall difference between merit and distinction. So what we're going to do is we'll look at the responses, what was done differently, and I'll try and throw in some answers. And what's worth noting is that at the time of recording, Pearson's haven't released a mark scheme for this paper. So generally any comments I'm making, any suggestions I put forward, they're based on my experience of teaching this, they're based on what I've seen in other papers, and also just comparing the two responses the students made. What I also thought I'd highlight with this exam paper, which is a little bit different from what I've seen in the past, is the four sections as they always are, 1, 2, 3 and 4, the topics they cover. The only thing that I've noticed that's different, particularly with this paper, was that the two sections, section 2 or scenario 2 and scenario 4, were both placing you as the student, as the person answering this paper, in the context. So you can see in that scenario 2, where are we going? You are employed as a support worker in the middle sentence, and for scenario 4, you have just started working as a student nurse. So normally the question where you are placed into that exam, where you are to take on the role, is normally the final question. So I don't believe I've seen a scenario 2 question where it says you are a character in this case study. That's been new, something I spotted this year. So we're going to look at the first section of student responses. So this is section C, as I say, A and B, very similar grades compared to one another. So this is the scenario C, where you've got Yusuf, who's 25 years old, moving into accommodation where he'll have full-time carers. He's got muscular dystrophy, he uses a wheelchair, and he needs support with his day-to-day care, particularly speaking and communicating. And the questions come up with asked about his healthcare, how his needs can be expressed, how he can not be discriminated against, how he can prevent discrimination, and again, responsibility for safety. Now the first question, the 2 marker here, was identify 2 healthcare needs Yusuf may need. Now the responses from those 2 students I had, these were the answers they put forward. So occupational therapists support physical movement and mobility, communication development, advocate or speech therapist, personal care, getting him dressed, and preparing meals, which are all care needs that Yusuf may have. Now in both cases, these students both scored 0 marks out of 2. Again, without seeing the mark scheme, my assumption being the keyword healthcare in that question. So the idea focusing more about his health and physical care, which would be medication like steroids, physiotherapy to help with muscle deterioration. Obviously they've mentioned occupational therapists to support physical movements and mobility, but again, that's not healthcare. That's normally more of the social care side. So you're going to be released from hospital, or the healthcare occupational therapist will make assessments on adaptations and things that need to be made at home to assist with mobility, whereas a physiotherapist is more of the healthcare, physically helping with his muscle movements. So again, until we see the mark scheme, obviously I'm making a guess that this is more that they want specifically health related issues, as opposed to what the students both presented, which were more kind of social care support arrangements. The second question we had is 2 ways Yusuf can be supported in expressing his preferences. Now the STEM, the source, does tell us that he needs help with speech and communication. Now, the first student, student A, they responded talking about a speech therapist can help Yusuf improve his speech and communication skills so he can express his preferences, possibly using Makaton or sign language. And then the second one says an advocate to speak on his behalf and only in the interests of Yusuf. Second answer, student B, said one way about supporting, provide an advocate to help express his preferences so he can receive the care he wants. Their second response was another way is using other forms of communication like sign language or writing down what he wants to say. Now, again, very similar responses for these students, particularly in A and B, but again here, similar grades. They both received 3 marks out of the 4. My feeling as to why they both dropped a mark comes from their second arguments, where they don't really come back to how this could help Yusuf express his preferences. The second B, student B, in their point, they do say it helps him write down what he wants to say. And obviously the advocate, they say speak on behalf, but whereas in their first points, they both mention the word preferences, help him express his preferences, speak and express his preferences. So that's my assumption as to why they didn't get the mark for the second. Because they obviously got the mark because it is correct, and I'm assuming they lost the mark for not tying it back to how that helps with his preferences. And then we move on to question 6. Now this is where we do start to see a little bit more difference between their responses. So how staff can make sure Yusuf is not discriminated against. Now they both produce quite substantial answers here, and what I've tried to do is highlight in sort of the red colour what are the key bits of the answers they put forward. So you can see the 2 differences, the way they're laid out. So student A wrote substantially more than student B. Student B has laid out their answer in these kind of 3 bullet points, 1, 2, 3. And the structure of their answer, I think, has helped with this. So with student A, they start off by talking about staff to follow policies and procedures, keep service users safe in safeguarding, which is good, but that's not discrimination. Safeguarding is different to discrimination. So we're talking, the first thing they say is that we should keep them safe, which isn't necessarily part of discrimination. They're separate issues. They do become more relevant, which is why it's in red. So they talk about follow the Equality Act and stop and direct or indirect discrimination from happening to Yusuf. Is part of the 9 protected characteristics, as he has a physical disability. So they do start off by saying follow the Equality Act, 9 protected characteristics, Yusuf is protected. Great. So that does hit discrimination. They then move into data protection, which again is an important thing. It is another way of protecting Yusuf. And again, if the question was how Yusuf is protected, Safeguarding, Equality Act, Data Protection Act, DBS checks, CCTV, perfect. But because it's more about how he's not being discriminated against, again, data protection here, that information is not really relevant to the question. Whistleblowing does come back in, which is great. So whistleblowing procedures, again, the main thing about whistleblowing is to raise concerns or issues, and in this case you could use it for Yusuf as a means of raising concerns, particularly if he was being discriminated against or his carers to raise issues. They talk a little bit about obviously about acknowledgement and respect for Yusuf, staff considerations should be taken and improvements should be made. So that is relevant. So that's one thing you can look at, why and how he's prevented from experiencing discrimination, whistleblowing and the Equality Act. Again, final bit, DBS checks, CCTV. CCTV may be on the border of preventing discrimination, but in here they talk about keeping him safe again. Mobility aids, again, it's more about personal care is kept discreet, so that's about data protection. Advocate is about helping him express himself. Wasn't really masses in there. Section B, sorry, student B, their answer is laid out in a much clearer way. 1, 2, 3. And the template is using, they've reworded the question. So staff can make sure Yusuf is not discriminated by promoting independence. And then they say this makes sure he's not discriminated against because it means that, that they make him feel confident. So they kind of talk about how they've prevented discrimination. Staff can make sure Yusuf is not discriminated against by promoting his rights and letting him have an input in his own care. And then how that stops discrimination, so he's respected. Staff can make sure he's not discriminated by having policies, for example, complaints procedure, and again, make sure he's not discriminated. So student B, the formula they've used of here's my point and here's how it stops discrimination, it's very much ticking that 1+1. Every point, here's a reason, here's a response. Reason, why, reason, why. And this maybe demonstrates the difference. So student A was awarded 4 marks for their response. So again, they've got Equality Act, they've got how it stops him being discriminated, whistleblowing, how that helps with discrimination or preventing discrimination. So that's kind of a 1+1, 1+1. Whereas student B, while they've written less, they have got a 1+1 3 times. So every point, and then they've developed it how it prevents discrimination. So that's one slight difference. I thought 2 different ways you could answer the same question: a very long response and a slightly more concise one. But the smaller concise response gets the marks because it's got a clearer one. Here's my point. Here's my way in which it stops discrimination. Much neater 1+1 system in place. And then we get to the 8 marker. So now we're looking at how Yusuf, how his carers can take responsibility for for their own safety when looking after Yusuf. Now again, there was a little bit of diversion here with the 2 student responses. The main difference we have, as you can see here, is obviously with student A, not a massively long response. But I think the wording of the question may have thrown them, because they took, obviously the question here is about how the carers can take responsibility for their safety. A majority of their answer, and again you can see the bits in red is what's relevant, so a lot of their answer here is about how the staff keep Yusuf safe when looking after him. So CCTV is accessible, again protecting Yusuf. The lone worker policy is mentioned, which is great, but they don't really develop it. They just say that it should be in place whenever the carer is alone with Yusuf. A care manager will know exactly who's working, where, what time, and so they can be checked. So that's absolutely perfect. Maybe a little bit more developed about what the care plan is or who comes up with the care plan. They then talk about policy and procedures, so prevention of infection, again followed, so carers and Yusuf are not exposed. So they've ticked the kind of bit of the question how the staff are kept safe, but they do tie it back into Yusuf as well. Whistleblowing, again it's about protection of Yusuf. Personal care and professional should be logged, so no accusations can be made without proof. Again, that needs a little bit more expansion. What do they mean? But overall, this answer got 3 out of 8. And you can kind of see where those 3 marks have come from. Lone worker policy is mentioned. Prevention for infection is probably another key point. But again, it's focused on Yusuf and the carer. And then that last one, personal care, should be logged to prevent accusations. So again, it's on the border of that safety, but not really fully developed. Now, student B had planned their answers, so they had come up with some ideas before they started writing, which I think is probably quite helpful. They also laid their answer out in kind of bullet point marks as they had done in previous responses. So the first thing they talk about is the carers take responsibility for their own safety. They have the lone worker policy. They talk about, well, he is still receiving domiciliary care. The carer must make sure they follow that policy to ensure their safety. They could, and what would have probably been beneficial is maybe say how or why. So what have they got to do to ensure their safety? And again, they say, however, the carer may take Yusuf on a walk and not inform someone. So they've not really done much. They kind of said there is a policy, but this is the issue. They've got a bit of evaluation in there. They talk about risk assessments, which is fantastic, identifying hazards, things that they need to do to ensure their safety. They will know what to do if a situation arises. However, during risk assessments, they may miss a risk, and that can be put in a dangerous situation. Another way is making sure Yusuf knows the emergency exits. Sorry, the carer knows the exits in case anything escalates. They talk about emergency contacts they can call. And again, this is all about keeping the person safe. Again, my main things with this response, they need a bit of how, they may need why, but overall this response is given 6 out of 8. And it's a good response. They've got some good ideas in there. They've tried to evaluate it to say, however, the other side is that even with this in place, the carers could still be put at risk, which I think is important with an 8 marker, to try and put in a bit of balance that, you know, you can do all this and have all this stuff in place, but these are the problems. But it got 6 out of 8. And overall for this section, we can see this difference already. So student A gets 10 out of 20 and student B has got 15 out of 20. And this is where, again, we started to see that difference emerge between A and B. And then finally, section D. So we'll move on to section D and quickly go through this topic here. So this is one where you are placed in the context, like in scenario 2. In this context, you're put in the role of a nurse, a student nurse at a hospital for children, a paediatric intensive care, and you're asked to identify a couple of things. Particularly, it kind of tells you in the STEM there are issues like how needles and waste are being handled or disposed of, and nurses are not washing hands. And it asks you about regulation, how you raise concerns, how you can improve practice, and how that practice will affect the children. So questions are not too complicated. So the first question we've got here, 2 ways in which staff who work in the unit are regulated. Now, my student responses here scored quite differently. So they got, well, we've got 0 and 1. Now, in both cases, they identified the NMC. Student A identified the CQC. Student B identified GMC. Now, the reason they didn't pick up marks from what I think, based on reading the question, is the key word there is ways. So they've both provided outlines or indication of who regulates staff, but they've not talked about the way in which staff are regulated, apart from student B, who mentions set standards of care. And obviously having a set standard of care is one way in which staff are regulated. So again, with this response, I believe that they've not picked up marks because they've not talked about how staff are regulated. They've mostly identified who regulates the staff. Second response, 2 ways that you could raise concerns about poor practice. So student A talks about whistleblowing policy. It's a type of complaint procedure. You use it to raise concerns. It should be followed up with feedback taken on board with a high standard. The second response they put is speak to the care manager, raise concerns, and they have the right to retrain staff or fire any carers. Now, they got 3 out of 4, and I think with this second response, I think that's a good one. Care manager, take the concerns, and then they've talked about how that issue is dealt with. With the first one, they talk about whistleblowing, and it's a type of complaint procedure, and it should be followed. They've talked about what the whistleblowing policy is. It's almost they've kind of said, this is whistleblowing, this is what it is, this is how it should be followed up. And really what they need to do with that first response maybe is just say how that would deal with the concerns of poor practice. So the idea that follow up with feedback will take on board to a high standard, or concerns raised will have to be addressed by staff or by care managers. So they'd have to add just something to say how or why whistleblowing policies would have an effect. Student B talks about informing the line manager so they can take action. And then they talk about whistleblowing and how these responses can be inspected by internal bodies. And they got 4 marks for that one. So again, I believe almost using sort of their point 1 of student B and point 2 of student A are pretty much the same. Inform your line manager and they will deal with it. Probably maybe student A did a slightly better response for that. Whereas with B, their second point about whistleblowing, form the NMC, this will lead to an internal inspection, and that sort of, it kind of says whistleblowing and this is the effect. Whereas student A says whistleblowing, this is what it is, and kind of defines the process. So that's where I can see the difference in their 2 marks. Both talk about whistleblowing, but student B is more specific about how it affects practice. Student A just defines what whistleblowing is. We then move on to explain how the hospital can improve its practices. Now, again, student A here identified the issues from the STEM. So they wrote down at the top of their response the practices that were being undertaken that were problematic. So the disposal of needles, contaminated bed linen and materials, the not washing of hands. And the response they give, and again, it's quite nice, it's those 3 bullet points, 3 factors. They've kind of nice structure to their answer. So the hospital could improve working practices, staff undergo training and revalidation. This will improve working practices, and they'll be able to dispose of needles, contaminate waste correctly. They talk about having internal inspections to pinpoint what exactly needs improving. They mention hand washing, and the hospital could also improve working practices at a unit by teaching. I think they're reaching, but they should be teaching staff codes of practice and policies and procedures they must follow. For example, how to properly dispose of needles and implement procedures for staff. Now, again, I did type this word for word, so this is kind of what the student put. The main bit, I think, their answer was they got 4 out of 6. And I think actually, to be honest, the first 2 points are pretty good, I would say. So they talked about staff training, how they can improve the practices. They talk about the needles, they talk about hand washing. It's this particularly, it's the final one for me, which doesn't add anything new. It kind of repeats what has already been said in the first 2. So actually, I've put those hows/whys down the side for the last point. But in reality, that final point doesn't actually add anything new to this discussion. What you could also, if they wanted to, is maybe say who is going to be making this difference. Student B, they talk about feedback from inspectors. Should they visit? That would improve training, and more training is needed. They then talk about preventing infection. They talk about how it should be updated, disposal of body fluid should be done correctly, washing hands. They talk about how long you should wash hands for at least 20 seconds. They mention retraining of the national standard of care. They could maybe expand on that, saying how or why or what standards particularly might be important. Policy and procedures should be updated and retrained. Again, how, why, what policies in particular. And then medication policy should be followed. Data protection policy. Again, that one doesn't really fit with the issue. And they talk about how cleaners or care support should be hired, so more hygiene in the unit stays high, which again isn't a terrible way in which you can improve practice, having more cleaners to focus on cleaning. Again, they mentioned the GMC, NMC policies should be followed. So this one wasn't as strong a response, but it was kind of a lot of their points needed more elaboration and needed more development. But it did score 5 out of 6. I think it's almost a bit like a scattergun. They threw enough things into the answer to hit those points. But I think there are bits in here which are not developed, not expanded on, which could be extended to make it more relevant and potentially pick up those extra marks. There are some bits in here that aren't particularly useful or aren't as helpful. So some of the stuff about I'm trying to remember where it was. I saw it, but some, there are bits. They mentioned data protection or other bits in here that aren't. Oh, there you go. And data protection policy, medication policy. They aren't issues that were mentioned. So almost that sort of a few middle bits of it could be expanded and developed. Okay, and finally, question 8. I'll just put both their responses up so you can see, because you can see the difference already. So this was about the impact of improved practice, and actually with this first response, the only bits that were, in my opinion, that felt like it was relevant about the impact of improved practice, particularly in this case, washing the hands, cleaning of waste, managing of needles, is treatment will be more successful, prevention for infection will be better. The rest of it, communication, personal experiences, that either is kind of just repeating the question, saying things will be better, and something like communication was never raised as an issue, and that was given 2. So I believe it was these bits in red that were the most relevant, probably awarding those 2 marks. Student B, they talk about empowerment of children, given the best care. However, children may not know what's good or what is good care. Improved practices resulting in less illness, less death. Again, doesn't remove any risk of children dying. Improved practices following the codes, so again, could help speed up recovery. And then lastly, improved practice in children. It makes the whole unit more holistic. And again, they talk about pies. And again, was given 7. So again, not always specifically focus on the question. And it is, again, a little bit more, let's get a bit of everything, if it's scattergun, throw it all on, with, again, some mini evaluations of highlighting that actually it's not always going to be perfect. There are going to be things that still undermine these improvements. But this was awarded 7 out of 8. And again, overall, you can see the difference, 9 out of 20, 17 out of 20. So with that previous section, I believe of 10 and 15, we're looking at 19 out of 40 for the second half, and 32 out of 40. So that's where this big divide between the merit and distinction started to take place. So again, in each case, I think the skills here is reading the question, looking at responses, and trying to make sure that you are addressing the question or any bits from the stem, and particularly these 8 markers we've seen with both responses, put in kind of evaluations or comments in to highlight the downside, the opposite of what you are discussing. So what I will try and do at some point, if this is helpful, is I will go through the full January 2022 paper. I'll take a look through that, and we'll look at the questions and think about how the paper was put together, or I'll look at the first 2 sections at the very least, and we can look at some responses to those. As always, I hope this has helped. Please like and subscribe to the channel. Please tell your friends, and if you are approaching this exam in the May of 2022, just obviously hope you have best of luck with it, and obviously watch other videos I've put together. Put a lot of stuff there for you to watch. So as always, thanks for watching. Take care.